parish of St Levin is just 3 miles from Land's End. It has the sea on one side and has the parishes of St Buryan and Sennan on its other boundaries. On its 4 miles of coastline, high granite cliffs and headlands drop down to the coves Penberth, Pedenvounder, Porthcurno, Porthchapel, Porthgwar and Nangizzle, where the stream that rushes down to the beach divides St Levin from Sennan parish. There's no real village focus in St Levin. It's really more a collection of hamlets of varying sizes, of which Porthcurno is probably the best known. The larger hamlets include the fishing cove of Penberth, which is now owned by the National Trust. And then there's Treen on the hill above with its popular Logan Rock Inn. And further on there's Trethuey and Polgigga, and then the little cove of Porthgwar, the farming hamlet of Trebeer, and just down the hill from there is what is known as Bottoms, where St Levin's School stands. The parish takes its name from the Celtic Saint Levin. It is said that St Levin lived near Bedellen, on the edge of what is now Porthcurno. But each day he walked to Porthchapel, where he had his tiny chapel, and where part of St Levin's well still exists. The Holy Well is reputed to have healing powers, and water from it is still sometimes used for baptisms at the nearby church. St Levin is very much a rural parish, where the people have traditionally gained their living from farming and fishing. But this once remote parish has had to change and adapt to economic and technological forces. Farming and fishing are in decline. The number of people still employed in these industries has dwindled. Where hundreds in this parish once worked on the land, it's now just a handful. And where 2 small fleets of fishing boats worked and men earned a tough living, now only a few boats put to sea each day. Tourism plays a part in the parish's economy. After all, who could resist the soft golden sand and turquoise sea at Porthcurno? And the world-renowned clifftop Minnock Theatre attracts thousands of visitors each year. But there's still a strong sense of continuity in St Levin's closely knit community. Many families have lived in the parish for generations, if not centuries, and there are plenty who still remember the old days and a way of life that has all but disappeared. And the Methodist chapel at Trethuey was once a hub of parish social life. The chapel and its Sunday school were filled each Sunday with services morning and evening, and for the children there was Sunday school in the afternoon. A welcome opportunity for parents to have an hour or so's peace from their large families. The Sunday school outing was eagerly awaited, and even in the 50s and 60s there was a big turnout for the event. Pleasures were simple, and everybody enjoyed themselves, from little children to older people who were keen to relax on a deck chair or even go for a dip in the sea. Sadly, the weather didn't always live up to expectations, but even that was something to laugh about. That once thriving part of village life is now facing a difficult future, though. There are now only 2 services a month, and Methodism, that great bastion of Cornish faith, no longer has the power to fill the empty pews of this large chapel. The older chapel at Treen has 2 services a month as well. Which of the 2 will survive in the future, though? The 15th century church still holds a service each Sunday. It has always played an important role in the procession of life. From baptisms to marriages, and then to the people's final resting place. In St Levin, like other rural communities, pleasures were simple, and entertainment was a welcome diversion from an otherwise hard-working life. The annual sports day has been a prominent part of the parish calendar for more than a century, and is still just as eagerly awaited as it was in the earlier decades. And of course, there were other entertainments too. In the 1950s, a group of men got together and built a boating pool.
Porthgorra Model Yacht Club, that started in the early 1950s, and it was based at Porthgorra, and the pool was Carnglaze Pool, which was situated up from Porthgorra on the heath, and we used to sail all through from March to September. There was different classes, well, different cups to be won. We had about a dozen or 15 that was really keen, and we'd get most all our boats we made ourselves, and then we'd make them up and who could get the fastest boat, and started another pool at Yesteryear. Yes, and down on the moor there we had a bulldozer in, and I really made a nice pool there and banks all around. Then we had an opening ceremony there. Charles Jackson Porthgorra, he was quite keen, and he opened that. It was quite good. We had our own pennant mast there, a pennant flag flying.
The community has worked and played together for centuries. Who knows how far back this tradition goes? After all, there's strong evidence of people living on the land here from as early as the Bronze Age, and there are traces of many later Iron Age fields. It all goes to show that today's farmers are simply continuing in the footsteps of their ancestors of 3,000 or more years ago. Farming has played a vital part in the work and lives of people in Saint Levin.
My father educated the girls, but the boys was more important to work. We used to get out in the mornings and milk our cows and come in, change and go to school. Walk half a mile and a half. These days they would have a taxi. We left school at 14 and come home on the farm to work, cold 6 o'clock in the morning to bring in the cows for them before the men come to work at 7. Father stayed in the bed, relaxed himself. Got out after breakfast. By the time the men come, 7 o'clock in the morning in those days, and they would milk the cows, and they would do up a few odd jobs, and by 10 o'clock they would have the croust, then what we call croust. They would have a little bit of food in their bag and a flask. That was always croust time, 10 o'clock. That was life everywhere in those days. Everybody, all the neighbours done the same, you know. That was the recognised thing. You went to school, come home and knelt on the farm and come in and had a cup of tea afterwards and put to work again. I used to work the horses. I was always make sure that I had Friday off to ride after the hunt. I had to have Friday off. Sometimes they met on a Saturday, but it was mostly Fridays in those days. When the Blythos was in, had the hunt then. Well, you used to have at least 30 or 40 to each meet. Saint Levin Feast was in October. Second week in October, I think. Somewhere used to be around the 12th. And always having a meet of hunt in the parish in those days, you know, and afterwards, when the hunt has gone home, a lot of people would come in and have tea, and would very often go down the local afterwards, celebrate a bit. When we were ploughing, we would mostly put in a pair of horses. If it was heavy going, we might put in the third one. Well, I had a hunter, and I used to put him in that as the third one instead of exercising them in the night. We could never find time by day. I used to go out in the dark, out in the field here. We got a field over here, about 8 acres, and I used to go out there right around the field for an hour and a half each night in the dark to keep my horse fit, so I could chase some of my friends. Or keep up with some of my friends.
Change in West Cornwall has come slowly but steadily over the years. There are many who still look back fondly on the days when horses did a lot of the work. Edith Angove grew up at the smithy at Pooljigga, where her father was the village blacksmith.
And my father, when he was 14 years old, wanted to be a blacksmith. He lived in Sennin Cove. And they all laughed at him because everyone down there is fisher folk. And he said, I don't care, I'm going to be a blacksmith. So he walked all around to the blacksmith shops, St Just and Buryan and everywhere. And then he ended up here at Saint Levin. And Mr. Mark said, well, I'm getting elderly and you can learn to be a blacksmith here if you like. So he walked 2 years from Sennin Cove here till he was a farrier. It takes 2 years to get a farrier. And when he passed through his exam, the last exam, the old man retired and Dad bought the business from him. During that 2 years, there was a very bad snowstorm and you couldn't pick out the roads from the hedges, you know, very high drifts and that. So he walked the cove and when he got to the farrier's shop, the boss said to him, you're 10 minutes late. He said, well, it was quite a job to get here, but he said, you're 10 minutes late. You can turn around and go back home again. You're too late, 10 minutes late, not employing anybody like that. So he walked back in the snow again, and he stayed at home at Sennin Cove for 2 or 3 days, and he got fed up with that, and he said, I'm going back there again. And he got back again, and Mr. Mark said, I was a bit hasty, boy, wasn't I? Well, he said, you can take your hammer and your anvil and go on working again. And when I got big enough, I used to help Dad to blow the bellows in the shed, because when they had 7 or 8 big wheels to bind with iron, you always had to have help. So the other blacksmith from New Shop would come here, and I would blow the fire just gently for them both to work. And then when he had a lot, we would cycle up there and help each other that way. But he shod 38 big cart horses here in his time, because there was no tractors anywhere. No tractors. All the farm land was worked by horses. Lovely big cart horses. Beautiful horses they were. But they were very heavy, because when you shoe their back feet, all their weight is on your hip to keep their leg up. And of course, when Dad got pension age, 65, he had to give up because of heart trouble, and he only lived 2 years for only a pension, so he died at 67 through heavy shoeing, see, a lot of heavy work.
In the 30s, horses began to give way to the first tractors. But horses were still used, particularly for ploughing the tiny little meadows that were used to grow early potatoes or flowers.
I lived my entire life in Saint Levin parish, born in the parish, and I've been a farmer all my life. I started off farming in Rosgestow. Back in the 1950s, when I started farming, there were 3 farms in Rosgestow. Over the years, as the other farmers have retired and some have passed away, we took over the other 2 farms in Rosgestow. Back in the 1950s, there was employment there for 6 people. And when we left, it was just 3 of us farming the whole of Rosgestow. And that was 230 acres. It just shows how machinery came in and took over from hand labour. Rosgestow was always very well known for growing early potatoes. We would plant the potatoes in January, end of January, and we'd start lifting at the end of May. And we'd always catch the early markets in London for the first early potatoes from Cornwall. And they always did extremely well. But as time has progressed, and particularly over the last 5 years, with transport being what it is, they can bring potatoes up now from the south of France and compete with us, and they can bring them up fairly cheaply. We lost the edge and the high prices we used to get for early potatoes.
Every farm had its mowie, where the dried hay and sheaves of corn were stacked in ricks for winter feed. The harvest was an important and busy time. It was the reward of a year's labour and much more dependent on fine weather than today. For centuries, corn was cut with a scythe and bound into sheaves by hand. But the effects of the Industrial Revolution began to be felt even in West Penwith. By 1900, at Truey Farm, a machine called a binder was at work behind a team of horses. This cut and bound the sheaves of corn in one operation, with men following to put the sheaves into a shock, 8 or so sheaves standing on end in a conical formation. From the late 19th century until the late 1930s, the threshing machine was worked with a steam engine. But that era died with the advent of the more convenient, economical and powerful tractor. The binder is at work in the 1950s on the Hockings farm at Sower. The tractor replaced horses in the 1940s. Often, shocks stood in the field for a week or two before being built into mows. Within a few weeks, depending on the weather, the sheaves would be pulled into the mowy, possibly for immediate threshing, or put into a rick for threshing later in the autumn or New Year. People used to get together at harvest time, when farmers and their workers would lend a hand at a neighbour's farm. The work was hard and often hot and dusty. Threshing day is recalled with much nostalgia.
So we all helped each other. You see, you needed a big gang to work the threshing machine, so all your neighbours would come in to help you, and then you would go out and help your neighbours. So for 2 weeks in September, 2 weeks in January, but all you ever did was out working the threshing machine. But the lovely thing about that used to be was the fellowship that went with it, because everyone came in for lunch, all around the big kitchen table. You had about 16, 20 men, all in the farm kitchen, all for lunch on threshing day. No farmer would ever allow his neighbours to see that his own farm was untidy. The pigsties were all lime washed, and the cowshed was lime washed, and everything was spick and span, because you wouldn't have a neighbour's workman go out and say, "Oh, this Kestel was untidy." That's one of the reasons why the farms were so much tidier then than they are today.
Feeding such a large army of men took some doing.
I tell you what, we had 2 days, and the first day we had roast beef for them all, and all the vegetables, and generally apple tart, of course, and cream. Got to put that on it, and cream. And the second day we also had pastas at Warren St. Just, and you know, it wouldn't do these days. I remember going up and getting them dinner time with my little van I had, where I put the milk factory, and I remember going up for them, and it was the earth floor. And the earth floor where they'd been walking used to go up and down. Wouldn't do today, we know. But that's what it was them days, and I used to bring them home exactly dinner time, and then order extra for children, because we knew they would been there, and that was our 2 days threshing, and that was done then for the 12 months. But everybody helped each other them days, when we had to go then, I suppose it took about a month nearly, I expect, to go right around nearly.
The use of the binder and threshing machine continued in St Levin into the early 1960s, until the combine harvester carried out both jobs in one operation. The combine is at work in the same field at Truey, 3 generations and almost 60 years after the binder was first used there with horses. The farms were mixed with dairy cows, some corn and the important cash crops, broccoli, early potatoes, and on some farms and in many of the little meadows, flowers were grown.
I can remember growing daffodils, and I remember out picking daffodils in the snow, and I can't believe how cold my hands got on that job. Yes, like the early potatoes, we could grow the daffodils earlier than anybody else. The Isles of Scilly obviously were earlier than St Levin, but when they more or less finished picking their flowers, we would carry on in this area, particularly in Pascora Valley and Walter down by St Levin Church, and down in Penberth. A lot of daffodils were grown, and they were a highly profitable crop.
Broccoli is still an important crop in St Levin, but the way it is harvested and planted has changed over the last 50 years. Pat Noy, who grew up on Trundrennan, remembers just how tough a job it was.
That was quite hard work. We had a mown on our backs, and they would cut it and throw it in the mown. When you got 1 or 2 or 3 in the bottom of it, it wasn't too bad. But that first one, dropping down hard in it, then it made it hard on your back, and that's the way we used to cut them them days, and go through right through all the rows, up and down, and they weren't like today, because I think today the broccoli to come in patches, and you cut all that patch right out. When they cut that out, but years ago, we had to go right through them all, whether, you know, if it's only for one broccoli, like, we had to go through them all because they aren't like the same as today. They're, you know, they're different sort of seed and all. I don't really understand them today because I've never done them like they are.
There have been fishermen in St Levin probably since prehistoric days. Pemberth was the traditional fishing cove, and it's easy to feel the timelessness of it. Even in the height of summer, it remains relatively undisturbed by Cornwall's influx of summer visitors. It's a quiet little place now, with just a handful of boats pulled up on the slipway, or Cornts, as it's locally known. But during the 18th and 19th centuries, when the Cornish pilchard industry was booming, life here in tiny Pemberth revolved around the mighty fish that was the very mainstay of Cornwall's fishing industry. This oily fish was the giver of all things. There was fish to eat, to sell and export. Even its oil was used to burn as a feeble little light in cottages, and any damaged fish could be used as valuable manure on the land. Nothing was wasted. Pilchards were caught by two methods, drift and seine nets. Drift nets formed a wall of nets suspended by corks floating on the surface, into which the fish swam and were caught by the gills, while the large seine net was used to surround a whole school of fish when they came into shallow water in the late summer. The seine net needed a lot of men, and so each year all the Pemberth fishermen had to leave their crab pots early in July and stand by ready for the pilchard's arrival. Everybody lent a hand, and the fish was brought ashore, mixed with salt, and piled row upon row in solid rectangular heaps on the floor of the pilchard cellar, ready for preparation and packing. Local legend says that it was a falling out in Pemberth among the fishing families. Some of them weren't happy with the sharing system that was operated by the Pilchard Seine Company and felt they were getting a raw deal. And so the Jackson family, along with a few others, decided they'd had enough of Pemberth and were going to move on. Of course, they didn't go far. The next but one cove, Porthgwarra, but they did establish a new fishing port. Until then, there hadn't really been anyone living there or fishing there. The Jacksons built houses and went fishing. They were a fiercely independent lot. Shellfish were that cove's mainstay, and even today, at low tide, you can see the remains of the ullies, as they were called, that were hollowed out of the rocks to hold the shellfish until there were enough to be sent away for sale. The Porthgwarra fishermen, and some farmers from nearby Roskestrel, did set themselves up with the same boat and net. They even pioneered a new method of dry salting fish. But the last really big catch was in 1916, when 3 million pilchards sold for a remarkable £4,500. Like the rest of St Levin, there was always a great sense of community, and everyone lent a hand when something had to be done, like hauling boats up the steep slipway with a hand-operated winch. It took a lot of manpower to turn that winch, and the grooves in the slipway or cornts can still be seen. In the 50s and 60s, men like Dick Rawlins and Walter Jackson still fished from Porthgwarra, but fishing finally all but died out in the cove. Back at Pemberth, life went on much the same, and even nowadays, when there's a shoal of fish, everybody turns out to lend a hand. In the 1990s, mullet was spotted in the cove, and word quickly flew around. And as Neil George said, when a shoal is spotted, cold or not, things have to be done. Up on the cliff, Barry Batten acted as hewer, directing the boats with some help from Teddy George. Neil George, who fished at Pemberth, remembers that cold day around Christmas when the colour was spotted, that telltale dark stain in the sea which means mullet. Now in Penwith there's deep secrecy about mullet. There is a distinct air of mystery about the method of catching, and indeed, just how much is caught. Ask a fisherman or anybody in a fishing cove about mullet, and they'll look you straight in the face and say, "Don't know what you're talking about." And so everybody got together. 2 boats, the Penny Lynn, with Terry and Neil George and Matt Rogers, and the Penver, with Richard Matthews and Michael Batten, used what are called tangle nets to catch the fish. The other boat, the Grey Seal, was used to bring the fish ashore. This particular catch was considered a nice little surprise. There's still a handful of boats fishing from Pemberth. It's a tough way of earning a living, but when it's in the blood, it's difficult to do anything else. In the 1930s, Pemberth Cove and the hamlet of Treen, and quite a bit of neighbouring land and property, were bought by the Fable family from Sheffield.
My family came down in the 1920s. The reason they came was that my uncle, Teddy Fable, suffered very badly from asthma. My grandfather bought some land up at Treen, including Treen village, and also some land the other side of the Pemberth Valley, including the farm at Bassein, as well as all the cottages in the Pemberth Valley and the land down to the sea. Cliff land up around the east side of Pemberth and round the other side as far as the Porthcurno Valley. My grandfather, Dr. Fable, who sadly I never met because he died in 1936, was obviously a very special man. Not only was he a doctor, but he was an archaeologist. He helped to unearth the steps down to Saint Levin's chapel, as well as being involved in archaeology at Chisolsta and Carnuni. And I believe some of his artifacts are in the museum in Troy. He also was a great horticulturalist. He laid out the plans for the garden, and he also bred daffodils from seed, which was a difficult thing to do then. And I'm happy to say that some of his bulbs are still in use in the breeding programme. My granny was a lovely lady. She was full of fun, although I was a bit in awe of her, I think, as all perhaps children are in those days. She ran a lovely, friendly house, but she was lucky enough to have some staff. She had a cook and someone to help clean, and there were 3 people to help in the garden. I remember as a child having wonderful holidays down here. I had 11 first cousins, and we all used to come together. I dread to think what effect it might have had on Granny, but we had a wonderful time. It seemed to be sunny every day then. Lots of boating and beach picnics. We have memorials in the way of bench ends in Saint Levin Church for not only Dr. Fable and Alice, my father's parents, but also my mother's parents, Admiral and Lady Talbot. He was a submariner. And then when my parents died, we put a pew end in their memory. So that's rather special. And our grandchildren have been baptised there, and one of our daughters was married there.
The sea has always played a big role in the parish's life and work. Saving lives has been a vital part of that. If there was a ship in trouble and lives at risk, then the local men left their work or the warmth of their homes and turned out to become auxiliary coastguards. In 1906, a coastguard station was built at Gwenup Head, high above Porthgwarra. But while the builders were still working on it, a ship was wrecked. On March 15th, 1905, the Liverpool ship, the Khyber, was headed up channel to Falmouth for orders. There was a strong southeasterly blowing, so strong in fact that it was impossible for the heavy iron ship to round the Lizard. Captain Henry Rothery decided to turn and head back down the channel. But as soon as the Khyber turned, tremendous seas swept over the decks, carrying away the lifeboats. A total of 23 men lost their lives that night, as the massive iron sailing ship was pounded to matchwood at Porthlow Cove, near Porthgwarra. Just 3 men survived the wreck: apprentices John Willis and Leonard Harris, and ship's mate Gus Johnson. Those remains that were found were given a Christian burial in a mass grave at St Levin Church. The Khyber was certainly one of the most traumatic wrecks, but each wreck and rescue is unique. In the early days, the equipment needed for a rescue was kept at Reskerstal Farm on the road to Porthgwarra. If it was needed, farmer George Williams had to go out, often in the dark, and catch the horses to harness them up to the wagon that hauled the equipment. Walter Williams, George's son, took over the job in 1942 when a lorry replaced the horses and wagon.
I owned all the life-saving apparatus from 1942 for 30 years. After a while that was made obsolete and I used the farm trailer. So it means to say every night that trailer had to be clean, spotless, so if I was called in the night, hook up the tractor and trailer and take it with all the apparatus, which was considerable, plus anything up to 18 men on it, to the wreck.
The treacherous rocks off the St Levin coast and around Land's End have claimed countless ships over the years. But no one was ever quite sure what happened to the French fishing trawler Vert Prairial, which ran ashore at Wireless Point near Porthcurno in 1956. The weather wasn't too bad and there'd been no distress signal, but she was found lying on her side.
There was one Vert Prairial which came in I think it was 1956. We were packing flowers for the market about 6 o'clock in the morning. I smelled an unusual smell and we never had a clue what it was until we had a call between just after 7 and we was called out to a wreck on the headland there under Wireless Point. Well, we were too late, all the lives were lost. There was I think 17 on board lost. But the part concerning that was, but after that she went ashore and they knew time it came in there because one of the crew was washed up on the beach at Porthcurno and they could tell by the time the watch stopped.
The Coast Guard service continues in the parish. The Coast Guard station was closed in 1994 when all operations for this sector were moved to Falmouth, but the work of the rescue team continues.
Hi, I'm Dave Jackson. I'm the station officer of the Land's End Coast Guard Cliff Rescue Team, and the area we cover is from Lamorna Cove around to Land's End and up to Airpoint near St Just. We have quite a lot of incidents in this particular part of the country, with people walking the coastal paths, lots of cliff climbers who decide to take a tumble now and again. That's where we come in to do a rescue, either recover them with a stretcher, or if it's a really bad incident, broken bones, fractured skull, that type of thing, we get the helicopters in from Culdrose to assist us, and then they're taken straight off to Trelisk. A while back, we had an incident with the Union Star and the Penley lifeboat, which I'm pretty sure a lot of people know about. We were tasked early one evening to go out and help Tolped and crew. We went straight to Tatterdew. Once we got on scene, the weather that night was horrendous, hurricane force winds. We had trouble standing up. We got on scene, we saw the tug standing offshore, and she was pitching and tossing, and she made her way out, and she was really up and down in the swell. The Union Star at that time was, as far as we could see, was upside down. We went around to the right hand side of her, looked across, and we carried all the gear through the bracken, which at the time was waist high. Bearing in mind it was blowing a hell of a gale, the sea was hitting the Union Star, coming up over us and going inland some 300 yards and raining down on us, and she was carrying fertiliser at the time, and I can remember tasting the fertiliser in my mouth and making the eyes sting as we were carrying the kit across. There was no sign of the lifeboat at the time. She obviously had gone. We did search the area, found the odd life jacket in one or two of the gullies. We were there all night, lots and lots of teams out from all around this coast. In the morning, the wind had died, the sea was flat, and all we had left then was the Union Star, and then came to light what had actually happened. Fate of everybody, they were lost, and it's just a case then of searching and trying to recover bodies.
St Levin had always been a remote parish, and not a lot has happened to cause change over the centuries. But then, in 1870, all that was about to change dramatically. The great Victorian age and its endless quest for progress, invention and engineering development was about to make its mark on sleepy little St Levin. It may seem rather archaic now, but in the 19th century, the telegraph was real cutting-edge technology. The excitement and potential rewards of making contact with someone hundreds or even thousands of miles away by the method of clicking a Morse key and sending a message whizzing along thousands of miles of cable was to make the world a smaller place.
The first cable was laid into Porthcurno in 1870, and this was a time of amazing change in world communications. By 1900 there were 14 cables, and more staff were arriving at Porthcurno. Each of the cables was manually operated, and a whole new team of staff were required to work them. So you can imagine more and more people squeezed into one building. So gradually more buildings were built in the valley as part of the telegraph station. This was the world's biggest telegraph station. The impact of the number of people coming down to work here must have been huge on the local community. Each of 14 cables would have had a team of people, and there were literally hundreds of additional people in the valley living in the telegraph station, buying services. The telegraph station would have employed local people to look after and service the staff. The social life of the telegraph engineers was very active. From records in the archive, we know that there were entertainments people shipped in on a regular basis, events such as thought-reading seances and all sorts of activities recorded in scrapbooks that we have here in the museum. In 1929, there was a merger between the Eastern Telegraph Company and Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company to create a new company called Imperial and International Communications Limited. But that name didn't last long for probably obvious reasons, and in 1934 the company became known as Cable and Wireless, and that name obviously is still very familiar to a lot of people here at Porthcurno today. In 1950, a formal engineering college was established, and this continued until 1993, when Cable and Wireless decided to move their training facility to the Midlands. The actual telegraph station, the operational side of the telegraph station, had closed down in 1970. That's 100 years after the first cable opened. In 1997, the Cable and Wireless Porthcurno and Collections Trust was established, known as the PK Trust. It's that trust which now operates the museum and looks after the historical gardens and other buildings in the centre of the valley. The main activity of the PK Trust, of course, is Porthcurno Telegraph Museum, and this has been a success. We have managed to attract over 100,000 people to the museum over recent years, and these people now understand the history of Porthcurno, whereas prior to that it wasn't anywhere near as accessible as it is now.
As news of war being declared was announced to the nation on September the 3rd, 1939, the people of St Levin made their own preparations. Nothing would ever be quite the same again. Blackout curtains and blinds were fixed to windows, and the first air raid siren was heard in the parish.
My father, Sam Nash, was in the Eastern Telegraph Company, and he was posted to Porthcurno in 1939 when I was 6 years old, and I came here with my mother and father and lived in the valley at number 10. We arrived in July 1939, 2 months before the outbreak of the Second World War. At that time, the telegraph office was in the building over there on the top floor. I well remember the day war was declared. It was a Sunday, and I remember an air raid warning from a siren located on top of the office, and we all had to go to an air raid shelter at number 4 The Valley, which was an Anderson shelter, and we sat in there for about an hour, and then the all clear went. No bombs were dropped, and as far as I know, no enemy aircraft were heard. A Scottish regiment was sent to Porthcurno. They were later replaced by some pioneer soldiers who installed a lot of barbed wire and pillboxes, established flamethrowers on the beach and a roadblock just below the post office. So it was all quite exciting at that time.
The telegraph station was vitally important to Britain's communication system, and the government told the Eastern Telegraph Company in no uncertain terms that it had to be protected. The existing building was camouflaged, and plans were made to put the station underground.
It was decided in 1940 to move the telegraph office into a more secure location, and to do this, 2 tunnels were cut into the hillside just behind here. The work was done by Cornish miners, and they started work in the autumn of 1940. The tennis courts were used to keep all the compressors needed for the pneumatic drills, and to carry the spoil from the tunnel, a little railway was established which ran along the front of the office and dumped all the waste onto an embankment which you can still see there. A lot of blasting went on, and while this was going on, stones were raining on the manager's house just here, and the manager and his family were evacuated to Porthgwarra. The work was completed in May 1941. The instruments from the office on the top of the building there all had to be moved into the tunnel, and my father was involved in that as the principal assistant to the engineer at that time, a Mr. W.E. Cleaver. Shortly after that, I remember there were a bombing raid on a Sunday evening, and I distinctly remember being in the house at number 10 The Valley, could hear the drone of the aircraft, the shriek of the bombs, and then the tremendous explosions which shook all the windows and walls and everything. They were in fact dropped on the farm, on Rossblether Farm. Fortunately the farmer, Mr. Donald Hocking, and his family were not there at the time.
There was 3 bombs dropped there about 2 fields away from our house. I believe there was 2 in our field and one in Roskestel, where Mr. Jackie Williams used to live. You know. There was a lot of stones scattered all over the fields, you know, and there was one who was going to be paid the most for picking these up.
The troops were billeted in what was the old Eastern Telegraph Company mess, which was closed in 1919, and the officers were billeted in the hotel just over there. There was also a first aid post run by the engineer's wife, Mrs. Cleaver, and she had a sort of voluntary detachment of nurses who looked after the troops for minor injuries and so on.
I was in the Red Cross when I was 17, and we used to have lectures across the hall with Dr. Dennis Leslie then, and when the troops came to Porthcurno, one of the officers asked would we take over to help them out, and they would fix a room for us to do the first aid in, to look after the troops. And we had to do anything from dressings to taking temperatures or whatever was needed. 6 of us used to go and attend to the troops. We had 2 junior ones, and they used to go with Mrs. Cleaver. She was the head one there, and we used to get on all right with the troops. It wasn't no bother. They knew as far as they could go with us, and they knew we wouldn't have any nonsense. So we used to start at 6 o'clock and finish 7:30. Sometimes it might be longer, all depends what had to be done. The MO used to come in the mornings, and he would leave a letter or something there for us to tell us what the troops had to have done.
Other entertainments were put on for the troops in the Exiles Hall, as it was called then, and they used to have frequent Ensa concerts, and also there was what were called socials, which were a sort of dancing and from a local provided by music by a local band, and games and so on.
If it was an Ensa concert on, we used to go to the Ensa concert. One of the blokes would take us in, because we weren't allowed to go in on our own. You had to go in with one of the troops. You used to know who was married and who wasn't married.
Porthcurno was heavily guarded, and visitors needed a pass to get in. Soldiers swarmed around the valley, protecting the telegraph station, the beach, and occupying huts on the hill above on Tregennan Farm.
Oh, we had a lot of soldiers. We had 100 and something here at a time. Different regiments. From Dunkirk we had, I know that. And then we had some Scottish ones.
And I well remember at breakfast one morning we heard an unearthly noise, like an animal baying, and what it was one of the Scottish officers was practicing his bagpipes, and he was actually walking on that road going up to the farm, walking up and down.
The war made an impact on the parish in many ways. Porthcurno Beach was heavily protected with massive rolls of barbed wire, gun emplacements, and even flamethrowers which could project their deadly blaze across the cove should the enemy arrive. There were fortifications in key places around the parish. There was even a lookout post at Portjigger, which was disguised as a bus stop.
On the hill opposite, some 2 rocket launchers were established later in the war. You can still see the platforms on which they were mounted. And also in that field were a couple of Nissen huts where ammunition was stored of various types.
The Saint Levin Home Guard was part of the 12th Land's End Battalion and took its duties seriously. Farmers and fishermen, the very young men and the older men who hadn't been called up, along with those who were in reserved occupations, all joined the platoon. Every Sunday they met for training, and once a week they'd do a night watch from their base at the Sunday school room at Trethewey and the east and west huts at Porthcurno.
I was in the Home Guard during the war. I remember Mr. Sidler from down Porthcurno coming up, and he said, "I want someone to go out on guard tonight." He said, "We're expecting the Germans to land." He said, "Take a pitchfork wheel." He said, "Take a pitchfork," he said, "and get in onto them quick," he said, "and get their rifle." He said, "If you get their rifle," he said, use it on them. First time we was put on the watch, we was sent up Sennin Cove. So we was put up on the cliff with a rifle and 10 bullets.
In the war, I carried the post for 3.5 years. I walked and cycled every day for 12 miles. All weathers, wet or fine, and for 6 days of the week. And in the afternoons, I had to go around half of the route again and empty the pillar boxes. They had to be emptied. And the mail would be at Porthcurno Post Office waiting for me to come back. Now, in those days, you see, they knew a lot of visitors, you see, at Porthgwara too, and they would post crabs and lobsters to them. So they would do them all up, and I had to carry all these on my back over the cliffs to Churchtown, back to the mail for the post in the afternoons. But it was very nice. Sometimes you're wet through, sometimes you weren't. Some days it's nice, some days it's hard work, but I did it, no problem. Our local man was called up in the army, you see, and there was nobody to take his job, so I said, "Oh, I'll do that." 12 miles a day and much. And I did that for 3.5 years till he came back again. He came back and took over his job again then.
Mechanisation, the telegraph station, even the war all brought change to St Levin, and changes will continue. I'm Phil Jackson, theatre manager at the Minnock since 1991. And the theatre's been here rather longer than that because Rowena Cade, who created the place, was born in Spondon, grew up in Cheltenham and moved here from Cheltenham in the early 20s and bought this headland off the Hocking family from Resbletha for £100 in 1923, had the house built that now overlooks the bay, and got involved with local amateur theatre, which was pretty busy with the cable and wireless contingent, a lot of theatrical people down there and the students and lecturers. And they got a bit adventurous and did a performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream in a local wood, which lit the touch paper really for the Minnock, because Rowena designed the costumes and made the props for it. And then they wanted to put on The Tempest, and the ideal place to put on The Tempest was on the cliff. She had a look around Porthcurno Bay and in the end decided that her garden was probably the best place for it. So with Billy Rawlings, her gardener, they created a stage that sits behind me now in the winter of 31-32 and put on the Tempest with mostly local performers. And from then on she just gradually added bits to it and spent 40 years of her life developing the theatre to what we see now. And Minnock is now an internationally famous venue and we employ up to 40 people here in the summer and 20 throughout the winter. So the local economy benefits from the 200,000 people coming to Minnock and the 40 people that are employed here. So the economy is rather different than years ago with the fishing and the farming and those industries. Tourism industry is now very big to St Levin and we look forward to a busy and successful and prominent future for the parish. Fishing no longer plays a significant part in the parish economy. And in the last 30 years, farming has seen a rapid rate of change. In 1901, there were 32 farms in St Levin. Now there are just 7. But the people of St Levin are a hardy breed, as resourceful and resilient as their ancestors. The changes faced by today's generation may be challenging, but life goes on, only differently.